As the ages drifted like fallen leaves upon the surface of a deep, still pond, there came a time when the memories of Queen Alara's tears began to fade from the immediate hearts of the living, retreating slowly into the dusty corners of old, forgotten libraries and the half-forgotten songs of wandering minstrels who no longer quite understood the depth of the lyrics they sang to the flickering firelight of village inns. The kingdom grew larger and more complex, its borders stretching further into the sun-drenched plains, and its cities buzzing with the hard, tangible realities of commerce, industry, and the pursuit of outward glory. In this rush toward a modern, structured world, a certain coldness began to seep into the marrow of the people, a subtle hardening of the heart that made them forget the quiet, restorative power of a shared sigh or the profound connection found in a moment of silent empathy. There was a king in those later days, many generations removed from the line of Alaric and Lyra, a man named Valerius, who prided himself on his logic, his tactical brilliance, and his unyielding, stony strength. He was a ruler who viewed the legends of the weeping queens and the vigils of the night as a quaint but ultimately distracting superstition of a less enlightened time, a ghost story told to keep children quiet in the dark. He looked at the castle of pale stone not as a living chronicle of the human spirit, but as a strategic fortification to be reinforced and modernized, and he found the stories of the private suite by the cliffside to be an affront to the image of regal, unshakable authority he wished to project to the rival nations that watched his borders with envious eyes. To Valerius, a ruler was a sun that never set, a beacon of unwavering light that had no room for the shifting shadows of the night or the supposed weakness of a tear. And so, with a sharp wave of his hand and the turning of a heavy iron key, he ordered the sacred chamber to be sealed, the tall, narrow window boarded up with thick planks of oak against the intrusive moonlight, and the room left to the spiders, the dust, and the slow, silent decay of time. He believed that by closing the door on sorrow, he was opening the door to a new era of unassailable power and progress, but he did not realize that by shutting out the darkness and the vulnerability it contained, he was also cutting the kingdom off from the very wellspring of its humanity. For a time, it seemed his logic was sound, as the granaries remained bursting with grain and the armies remained victorious in every skirmish. But a slow, creeping drought began to affect the spirit of the land, a persistent dryness of the soul that no amount of summer rain or mountain runoff could quench. People forgot how to truly listen to the nuances of one another's voices. The music in the streets became repetitive, loud, and hollow, and the laughter in the taverns lacked the genuine, resonant warmth of connection, sounding instead like the clatter of dry bones. The kingdom was becoming a magnificent hollow shell, a grand statue with a polished exterior, but no heart beating inside to give it meaning. It was during this spiritual winter, when the air itself seemed thin and brittle, that a young woman named Alara, named for the queen of old, but born into a family of simple, hard-working stonemasons, found herself drawn to the high castle walls. She had been born with a rare gift for feeling the hidden vibrations of the earth and the silent stories held within the grain of the rock, and as she worked on repairing the weathered, salt-pitted stones of the outer ramparts, she felt a strange rhythmic throbbing coming from deep within the castle's ancient core. It was a sound like a muffled heartbeat, a persistent liquid pulsing that seemed to be pleading for release from a long and lonely imprisonment. Driven by a curiosity that felt more like a summons from the very foundation of the world, Alara followed the sensation through the winding, torch-lit corridors and up the narrow, spiral staircases that smelled of damp earth and old echoes, moving like a shadow through the halls of power until she stood before the forgotten, iron-banded door of the royal suite. The wood was dry and brittle to the touch, the iron rusted into jagged flakes by the relentless salt air, but the energy radiating from behind the threshold was as potent and electric as the air before a summer storm. Without knowing why, and with a heart that pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird, she placed her small, calloused hand against the wood and whispered the name of the queen she had been named after, a name that felt like a heavy, ancient prayer on her lips. In that moment, a strange thing happened. The boards covering the window inside the room suddenly fell away, shattered by a sudden, powerful gust of wind that swept up from the crashing sea below, and a single piercing beam of silver moonlight struck the keyhole, striking the girl's hand with the brilliance of a fallen star. The lock, which had resisted the strength of the king's strongest men for decades, turned with a soft, melodic click that sounded like a chord played on a distant harp, and the door swung open on silent hinges to reveal the chamber exactly as it had been left so long ago. The air inside was thick with the scent of ancient dried lavender and the unmistakable sharp tang of salt, and as Alara stepped hesitantly into the room, she saw the ivory chair sitting in the pool of silver light, looking for all the world as if it were waiting for a dear friend to return from a long journey. She walked to the window and saw the crystalline indentations on the sill, glowing now with a fierce inner fire that seemed to pulse in perfect time with her own quickening heartbeat. She sat in the chair, feeling the cool smoothness of the ivory against her skin, and looked out at the wheeling stars, and for the first time in her life she felt the full, crushing weight of the world, not as a burden that would break her, but as a profound, beautiful, and necessary responsibility. She thought of the coldness that had gripped her neighbors, the way the people had turned their faces away from one another in their rush for gold and status, and she felt a deep, aching sorrow for all the softness and the kindness that had been lost in the pursuit of a hollow perfection. And then, as the moon reached its zenith and the world below fell into its deepest slumber, the tears began to fall from her eyes. They were not her tears alone. They were the accumulated, pent-up tears of a century of unexpressed grief, the water that had been dammed up behind the wall of the king's pride and the people's forgetfulness. As each drop hit the stone of the windowsill, the rhythm of the entire castle seemed to shift and settle, the ancient timbers groaning in a long-delayed sigh of relief, and the wind carrying the soft, melodic sound of her weeping down from the heights and into the valley below, where it moved through the streets like a gentle mist. The drought of the spirit began to break that very night, though few could have said why. In the village, a man who had not spoken a word to his brother in 20 bitter years felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to knock on his door and share a cup of tea. A poet who had found no inspiration for a decade picked up his discarded pen and wrote a single line of such breathtaking, raw beauty that he wept for the sheer joy of feeling something again. And King Valerius, sleeping fitfully in his grand, sterile bed, dreamt for the first time of a rain that smelled like summer lavender, and woke with a wet face and a heart that felt strangely, wonderfully light, as if a suit of armor he hadn't known he was wearing had finally been unbuckled. The room was no longer a secret to be feared or a superstition to be suppressed, but a source of life and renewal, a place where the kingdom's collective soul was washed clean every single night. Alara remained in the castle, not as a titled queen or a political figure, but as a keeper of the vigil, a woman who understood that her most important task was to be the vessel for the feelings that others were too busy, too tired, or too afraid to acknowledge in the bright, harsh light of the day. The kingdom entered a new golden age, one that was defined not by the height of its walls or the weight of its gold, but by the staggering depth of its compassion and the resilience of its empathy. People began to realize once again that to be whole, one must be willing to be broken, and that the most beautiful things in life are often the ones that are forged in the quiet, private fire of our most vulnerable moments. The story of the queen who cried became a living, breathing reality once again, a constant reminder that the night is not a void to be feared or a darkness to be conquered, but a sanctuary to be embraced and honored. The light of each new dawn felt exponentially brighter after the vigil, the colors of the grass and the sky more vivid, and the invisible connections between people more resilient than the strongest iron. As the generations continued to roll on like the waves of the Emerald Sea, the ritual was passed down not through royal bloodlines or legal decrees, but through the unmistakable call of the heart, a lineage of watchers who sat by the window and wept for the sheer, overwhelming mystery of being alive in a world of such light and such shadow. The castle became a place of true pilgrimage for those who felt the weight of existence too heavily, and they would come from distant lands just to stand near the walls and
subscribe to the channel to continue the story in the next part.